I know a lot of you people out there don't understand. But there is a need for the world to know about this, because the church is hiding and the government's hiding. There is a lot of people that died in those places.
When God is on our side, we can commit any crime. We're absolved individually from that crime by believing that we have a higher sanction. And that's the danger of religion, in that it allows people to do that. It allows them to kill without a shred of conscience.
The church knows where our children are buried. 50,000 died.
It was the first public and only public delisting of a minister in United Church history. It was really like a show trial to make an example of me. But at that trial, the lawyer for the United Church, a fellow called Ian Benson, he said the reason these Reverend Annett is being recommended for delisting is not because of anything he did while in the ministry, but because of comments he's recently made to the press about the deaths of children in Indian residential schools. So they were very clear. They wanted to get rid of me because I was continuing to talk about these deaths and murders.
So in the period after I was fired from my job in Port Alberni, my wife and family and I had to move back to Vancouver, where I could seek out retraining of some kind. I enrolled at the University of British Columbia. And basically at that point the attitude of the church was to put me on ice and try to ignore me. And it wasn't until February 1996 that they suddenly revived their demand that I be expelled from the church altogether. And interestingly enough, they did that 2 days after it was publicly announced that the first lawsuits would begin against the United Church and the federal government, brought by survivors of the Alberni Residential School. A lot of these plaintiffs that were suing the United Church had been in my congregation. I had been working with them, providing them information. Obviously the church wanted at that point to just expel me from the church altogether.
The purpose of the hearing was a total railroading and a processing to get somebody who had far too much information for his own good out of there. He'd stepped on big toes. He'd stepped on moneyed toes. And the whole thing was to get Kevin Annett out of there.
So sure enough, that same year in 1996, the United Church decides to go ahead and defrock me as a minister. I think the antiseptic term they used was delist. And in so doing, they spent over $250,000 tossing me out of the church. Something I found pretty repugnant, because that previous year, the church had told me that they couldn't come up with about $1,000 a month to feed the over 300 hungry families that we're providing food for through our Loaves and Fishes food bank in Port Alberni. And yet here's suddenly $250,000 to get rid of one whistleblower. Also, the two men who had originally arranged my firing from Port Alberni, John Jessamine, the lawyer for the United Church, and Brian Thorpe, the chief executive officer in BC for the church, these are the two guys who are not only responsible for my appeal, but for setting up the panel that's going to decide whether I'm going to remain a minister or not. So the whole thing from start to finish was a complete travesty of justice.
It was terrible. At moments, I really wondered if I were in Guatemala or Mexico, rather than this quiet, late summer afternoon in this church in downtown Vancouver. I couldn't believe the things I was hearing. The whole thing, I mean, I just remember, for example, that Kevin Annett had a great number of unsolicited letters of commendation for his work and his ministry. And he had always made his ministry a tough ministry, a challenging ministry. And I think that all these letters had come in, and not one of them was allowed to be read. I believe Mr. Jessamine said, people here can read for themselves, these letters don't need to be read. But isn't it interesting that at the end of that hearing, Mr. Jessamine didn't have the same philosophy at all? Because when they solicited letters against Kevin Annett, and we know this from a person who phoned in from Manitoba, when they solicited these letters, all of those were read and put on the record.
You know, for centuries, people have had three basic rights under common law. Those are, the first is the right to no charges being brought against you. the second, the right to face your accusers, and the third, the right to a trial before your own peers. Now, all three of those rights, called natural law, were totally denied me by that proceeding that threw me out of the United Church altogether as a minister. To give you an example of that, I was never told what the charges were against me. They repeatedly said, there are no charges against you. I asked to face my accusers. I said, who are the people who brought these concerns to you about my ministry? They refused to tell me who they were. And finally, when I'm appearing before that delisting panel, they weren't in any way my peers. They weren't people who I knew. They were three hand-picked individuals who were actually friends and associates of one of the men who had me fired, Brian Thorpe.
I feel it will remain a very black mark against the United Church of Canada. It was a very disgusting type of procedure. I would call it a witch hunt. It was a question in my mind as to why a church would be carrying out such an activity, why they would be spending the money. I mean, there are many aspects to this. I think probably the important one is an attempt to simply break down a personality. And why they should be wanting to do this. Reverend Annett was someone who had the trust of the natives, of those underprivileged. And it seemed to me that the church should have been making use of him.
Finally, one of the most absurd things is, right at the very beginning of the proceedings, we asked the panel, what are the grounds for defrocking a minister in the United Church? We have to know that in order to mount some kind of defense, to show that, in fact, I am a credible minister. Molly Williams, who was head of the panel, said, in front of all of us, she said, there are no grounds for delisting a minister. We will decide what those grounds are at the end of the hearing. So by doing that, there was no way I could mount a defense, because I didn't even know what the terms of the whole hearing were.
I mainly took down notes of things where events in that hearing did not conform to the laws of natural justice. In the first place, there was no charge. There never was a charge through the whole hearing. Now, the church people have lied about it since and said there was a charge. There absolutely wasn't. If they want to look at the church records, there was no charge. They kept saying there is no charge. We only want to see if Reverend Annett is suitable for ministry or not. The charges never even got made up. The first I saw of them was late March with a letter that came out in the Courier where suddenly I saw charges listed against Kevin Annett. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense that went on, but very dangerous and very hurtful nonsense.
The people who I counted on as who would stand by me, they all ran for the hills. I mean, people in the churches, it was kind of like, I call it the leper complex. They know to give you a wide berth, because if they get close to you, it might happen to them too. So I was pretty much ostracized. And speaking of South African apartheid, it's like being a banned person. In South Africa, when you were banned, you couldn't meet with more than two people. Your name couldn't be mentioned in the press, etc. That's basically the situation I'm in. The media won't cover my stuff. There's all this story out there about how Kevin Annett is crazy and trying to bring down the church and blah, blah, blah. And that's so that the people in the wider society never have to look at what I'm talking about, look at the evidence, because it's a way of keeping that evidence delegitimated, and it works.
I can't believe what went on there. And, I think that Jack Bell said it all. He just couldn't stand to watch it. It was obvious that you had stepped on some pretty big toes and that you were going to be slaughtered for it.
On March 7th, 1997, Kevin Annett was permanently expelled from United Church ministry, despite the failure of church officials to offer any evidence that he was unsuitable for that calling. His expulsion was final and could not be appealed. The same day, Kevin was issued a legal writ by church lawyers that tried to prevent him from speaking about his delisting trial or any issue involving Native people and stolen Indigenous land. Kevin ignored this gag order and continued to speak out publicly about his firing without cause and expulsion without due process from the church responsible for the deaths of so many innocent children.
Historically, it was interesting how everything was coinciding, because as I got thrown out of the church, the first lawsuits were being brought against the church and the government by the survivors of residential schools. This would have been in early 1996. And right at the same time, kind of like the attitude was, well, you got tossed out of the church, you must have done something right, kind of from the point of view of Native people. And they began to, the trust level went way up because I wasn't part of that institution anymore. And I was being invited down to these healing circles in the downtown east side of Vancouver to listen to people's stories. And then eventually they began to ask me to record them for them. And that's when I began to seriously document a lot of these stories that went...
Up until that point, you had not documented anything that was said at the
Well,
church?
I hadn't systematically gone about it. I had, written down notes and that people had shared with me, but it was clear from the things they were sharing that this went far beyond the physical and sexual abuses that are talked about in the press. Well, they're not talked much anymore about, but for a while they were. People were describing children being sterilized, being murdered, being used in medical experiments, being deliberately exposed to tuberculosis and then left to die. They realized, and I realized with them, that all we were doing is sitting around hearing everybody's sad stories, and it wasn't going anywhere. The people were not recovering from this. There were a lot of lawyers and Native politicians making money off their pain, but they weren't changing anything in their life. I'd know people who'd tell their story and then go kill themselves.
Well, was there a design to heal people, or was there just a design to have people talk?
Healing is a word from the dominant society. It's a way for people to make money off other people. People don't heal from this. That's the reality. The first thing to realize is that I'm never going to get over this because it's not only so traumatic, but it's so systematic in the culture. You can't heal as a Native person. The whole society is arranged against you. What you can do is to tell the truth. And I realized that about myself. I was never going to recover from this. I'm never going to be allowed into the academic world. I'm not going to be allowed to have a job anywhere in Canada. And they actually threatened me with that. There was a guy called Art Anderson who was personnel officer for the United Church who had removed me. He had come in the day and handed me the letter that fired me. And he told Bruce Gunn, my friend, United Church clergyman up in a house, he said, 6 months after I was fired, he met him at a conference and he said, Bruce, if you have any pull with Kevin, you better tell him that he'll never work in this province again unless he plays ball. And sure enough, that was an idle threat. They blocked my PhD at UBC. Every time I went to apply for work, they had been spoken to, the prospective employer. That happened a few times. There was a systematic campaign. So I knew that, like with the Native people, I was never going to get over this. But what I could do, just like them, I could tell the truth. And that was our power, just telling the truth. And that's what we began to do. Okay, we got to do more than just talk about our pain. We got to ask the bigger question, why did it happen and who did it? And why did they do it, right? So we said the way to do this is to hold a big inquiry. And we started inviting Aboriginal groups from around the world and this United Nations group, IRAM, to come in. And that's what happened in the summer of 1998 in Vancouver. I organized a lot of the survivors to come and give testimony at this. And at that tribunal, anything you could ever imagine that went on in a Nazi death camp was described. There was a group of people from the Cooper Island Catholic school who described being part of a medical experiment in 1939 when German-speaking doctors were injecting them in their chests with these chemicals that was killing them.
I'm 100% sure that we're used as guinea pigs in these local hospitals for some unknown reason. We're lugged off the hospital, I can remember that. And I know it wasn't for dentistry, I know I wasn't sick.
I read Kevin Annette's document starting about 6 months ago, and it helped me understand how come my memory was so vague. In reading parts of it, they talked about shock treatment. In my last year there, the spring of 1961, I was taken from the school to Charles Camsell Indian Hospital, and from Charles Camsell Indian Hospital to Ponoka Mental Institute. I don't know if I was there a week or 2 weeks, but I have vague memories of it, but the memory that flashed back for me is laying on this table and stuff in my head, and then these flashing lights just continually.
They had put needles in my head and had hooked them up electrically and would zap me. At that time, my arms were put in a chair and locked in so I couldn't move. And my head was put on a brace in the back so I was like this, I couldn't move. And I can't tell you how long they had done it. All I remember is that I still, to this day, I still get like my brain will still had that kind of a kick from it, right?
Right.
And they had done a lot of bad things by putting medications in the food while I was in the dark room, bringing the food in, and you had to eat it, and if you didn't eat it, then if you threw it up into a bag, they'd put it on the plate again and make you eat it.
I also went to the tribunal that was held, and although I've been with Amnesty since 1961, I had to walk out of that tribunal as the sobbing went on around me, and the gulping for air, and the crying of the natives as they told their stories. And I couldn't imagine, you know, Canadian men, policemen, fathers and grandfathers going in and taking children out of the arms of native parents and putting them on a gunboat and taking them to these schools like Port Alberni. That all came out at that tribunal. I thought, my goodness, how could they take little 5- and 6-year-olds? And as a grandparent myself with a little 5-year-old, how dependent he is on family. How could they take those children to these schools where at best they were treated with indifference, but as we know, so much worse went on there.
We've had Chief Harry Nice, we've had Chief Joe Gosnell, we've had Chief Ernie Cray sitting in this room with tears in their eyes describing it to me themselves on television. I mean, it happened. We know it happened, and it happened in our lifetime, right? It's not 150 years ago.
Was there proof, though? Like Nazis...
Scars. They showed me the scars, and they also...
Anything written down? Any doctors write down that they went to it?
I did find documents in the Indian Affairs Archives describing these doctors, and how what was interesting was the order that was running the school, a Catholic order called the Montforts. As soon as some children escaped from these experiments, they went to the local, their families. The local police refused to return the children to the school because of these horror stories they were hearing. The next day, all the Montfort brothers resigned. They were just taken right out of there. And the Oblates come in to replace them. So there was something very odd going on, and a number of the children died, and I found the death records and everything. So there was that kind of stuff going on.
Well, did the tribunal ask for proof, written proof? Or did they accept the oral proof?
Well, they had both. They had the oral proof, and they also had the corroborating proof that this stuff was going on. They also subpoenaed the government and the churches and the RCMP to come and answer questions, because ultimately they're the ones with the evidence, the documentation of this. And every single one of them, from Jean Chrétien right on down, they just refused to come. They never answered or anything. But I mean, other things were described, the sterilization hospitals. Women showed up who described being sterilized simply because they were Indians and wouldn't go to church.
I couldn't have any more children after Dr. Darby got to me. He made an announcement in our village that anyone who wasn't in church on Sunday had to report to him for a special procedure. I never went to his United Church since they did so much harm. But Darby was missionary, so his word was law. So the Mounties came and got me and brought me to Darby. He gave me a shot. Next thing I knew, I was in bed, all bruised and hurting. I was missing all my gold teeth. Something didn't feel right inside me. I never could conceive after that. Later, another doctor told me I'd been sterilized. George Darby, he did that to hundreds of our women.
As part of the eugenics movement that swept the world after the 1920s, laws to allow the sterilization of Aboriginal men, women, and children were passed across Canada under pressure from both Catholic and Protestant churches, in Alberta in 1928 and in British Columbia in 1933. Missionary doctors of the Anglican, Catholic, and United Church of Canada sterilized thousands of Native people in hospitals all over Canada, as part of the campaign to depopulate Aboriginal land to allow its occupation by European settlers and corporations. The main targets of the sterilization program were the traditional leaders of the Aboriginal nations, the tribal chieftains and their families, who were slated for extermination. Accordingly, the sterilization campaign against traditional families has continued to the present day. Dr. James Goodbrand sterilized many of our women. In 1952, when he heard I was going to marry a traditional chief, Goodbrand kept saying to me, "If you marry Freddie, I'll have to do an operation on you." That scared me, and I tried to see another doctor, but the Indian agent wouldn't let me. So when I gave birth to my daughter, it was Goodbrand who delivered her. After the birth, I hurt really bad and I kept bleeding. Then I learned that my tubes had been tied. He must have done it to me after the delivery when I was still unconscious. I heard Goodbrand say he was getting paid $300 by the government for every Indian woman he sterilized.
Were there any white people that gave testimony as to this happening?
There was a couple of staff members from the Alberni School who gave testimony, Caucasian staff members, and they confirmed everything and more than what the people were saying.
So what was the results? What did the tribunal do?
Well, the result of the tribunal was they sent a report to the United Nations to Mary Robinson, was High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, at the UN office there, and they sent a report to her. I sent 14 hours of videotape plus all of the documentation and affidavits and everything to her office. We never heard a thing. Never got back to us. And a couple of years later I learned that it was because of pressure that Canada brought to bear at the UN to keep this issue under the wraps, basically.
How could Canada do that? You mean Canada can influence the United Nations?
Well, it has a lot of pull. For example, at the time, the General Secretary's assistant was a woman, Denise Frechette, who was a career civil servant from the Department of National Defense in Ottawa, and she was the one at the UN setting the agenda of all these different, divisions and committees at the UN. So it would have been easy for her and others to keep this off the agenda.
As an arm of the Canadian government, the United Church of Canada has led this attack against Kevin Annett and his work, with the active support of covert operatives of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Cooperation between the RCMP and United Church in this silencing campaign against Kevin Annett began as early as June 4, 1996, when church official John Siebert wrote to Sergeant Paul Wilms of the RCMP's E Division in Vancouver to share confidential information about Kevin, after he had spoken out in the media about the deaths of children in United Church Indian residential schools. That same month, Sergeant Wilms used this information to confront and threaten Kevin if he did not stop making public allegations of murders in residential schools. When Kevin refused to stop investigating residential school crimes, this joint harassment campaign against him by the United Church and the RCMP intensified. Between 1997 and 1998, church officials sabotaged Kevin's doctoral program of studies at the University of British Columbia by blocking funding for him, which forced Kevin to withdraw from the program. One of Kevin's professors admits having been spoken to by RCMP officers about what they called the dangerous nature of Kevin's research into United Church residential schools. Yet by far the most serious attacks on Kevin Annett and his supporters came in the wake of the historic tribunal into residential schools that Kevin organized in June of 1998 in Vancouver. His success in bringing United Nations observers to this event to hear residential school survivors' testimonies caused the government to directly subvert and destroy Kevin's work.
Naturally, it was sabotaged. And when you get big enough, it's kind of like being a germ in a system. You get big enough and the antibodies attack you, and that's what happened. It was clear from the tribunal that a lot of crimes that had never been heard about were finally out there publicly. People talked about sterilizations for the first time, the medical experiments that they were doing on kids at the Catholic and United Church hospitals and the residential schools on the West Coast. That was all talked about. We sent it off to the United Nations, and in retaliation, a lot of shit came down on the people who did it. I mean, Harriet Nahani, who was the person who identified, that the little girl had been killed, murdered at the residential school, United Church, when she was a witness to it. The RCMP broke into her house without a warrant 2 weeks after the tribunal. The RCMP tactical squad ransacked the house at gunpoint, held everybody at gunpoint, and just ransacked the house. People were threatened. They were thrown out of their jobs on the reserve after they'd given testimonies. I started getting followed around by these two guys who physically attacked me on 2 occasions. This was all within a month or two of the tribunal, so the heat began to come down. And I knew it is because things that were shared at the tribunal weren't just about the past. They were about pedophile rings that are being operated today with the help of native politicians and church lawyers. It was about crimes of the present that were begun in the past but carried on today in the Aboriginal world. It all the veil began to lift for me. I realized I've got a real tiger by the tail here. It isn't just about something that happened years ago, because if it was, why would the harassment continue? I mean, the stuff in the past has been resolved. They've bought off the witnesses. They've paid off people with court settlements.
So why did they continue then?
They continued the harassment because this is about stuff today. This is about how Native people are still being exploited, how Native children are still being used, how land is still being stolen by multinational corporations, and how the Native politicians are important to this whole thing. And so they don't want the truth of the residential schools brought up because they themselves are implicated in these crimes. When they were kids, they were the enforcers. They were the ones who helped abuse and control their fellow students. So they don't want that coming out. And I began to learn that after the tribunal. And like I say, the proof was in the pudding. We were shut down. The results of the tribunal were never acted on by the UN. The media imposed a blackout on the whole issue. I was completely isolated. In the year after the tribunal, it felt like a wall was falling down around me.
Was it?
Yes, these cage doors were just closing on me, bang, bang, bang. The media wouldn't talk to me anymore. My letters weren't printed. People stopped talking to me. The Native chiefs wouldn't have anything to do with me. It was just absolute shutdown on every front.
So, why did you continue?
Well, I didn't really want to at first. It felt like this is pointless. I'm up against the state. I'm up against the church, multinationals, their Native accomplices. I mean, who the hell is going to support me? The Natives don't want to because they're too scared for their life. The whites don't want to because they see me as a traitor. So I didn't feel I could proceed, but there was something, my mind was telling me that, but there was something inside me that was very stubborn and said, you have to keep going.
In the years following the Residential Schools Tribunal, Kevin Annett persisted in his efforts to document and make public the evidence of mass murder and ethnic cleansing in Canada. Abandoned, penniless, and attacked from all sides, Kevin nevertheless continued to speak out publicly on the hidden history of mass murder in Canada, and kept on documenting all that he had been told and had discovered about crimes against Native people. But Kevin's crowning achievement came in early 2001, when he finally published the accumulated testimonies and documents about atrocities in Canadian Indian residential schools, in a book entitled Hidden from History, The Canadian Holocaust. A dozen separate publishers refused to produce the book, so Kevin printed it himself and circulated more than 1,000 copies to libraries, governments, human rights groups, and Aboriginal people around the world. But most of the books ended up in the hands of the people for whom Kevin had labored so long, the residential school survivors themselves. In the fall of 2005, Kevin completed the much expanded second edition of Hidden from History, and for the first time asked the deeper question of why legal genocide had happened in his country, what had given rise to this plague in the first place, and why is it continuing?
Kevin, you've remarked to me that the tides are changing, that things slowly are becoming made known. Yes, they are. It is very slow. Remember, it was 10 years ago that hearing took place. But I do believe that the changes that have come about are because of the price you have paid. A terrible price of what you have paid.
I think his work has been serving a really valuable purpose by bringing, first and foremostly, these issues to light. And I know Kevin's had to endure a lot of suffering and a lot of loss, particularly in his work, his livelihood, his being defrocked and losing his congregation, and subsequent attacks by the church, police positions and powers of authority. And a lot of the Native people that Kevin has worked with in the past as well have suffered attacks, people having their automobiles tampered with, putting their lives in jeopardy, being attacked and under constant surveillance by hostile occupational forces such as the RCMP.
Let's fire Kevin Annett if he doesn't have a job. He doesn't do the work he does in the community, and that's exactly what happened. And as anyone knows who was involved at that time, we tried desperately to convince the United Church not to fire Kevin Annett because he was doing a lot of good work. But of course, our pleas fell on deaf ears because those people didn't live in the community, they didn't witness the good work Kevin did, and the end result is their legacy of corruption continues.
Church officials have repeatedly silenced journalists and prevented publications from reporting the facts of both crimes in Indian residential schools and Kevin Annett's expulsion from the church. In January of 1999, the globally acclaimed magazine The New Internationalist ran a brief article on Kevin Annett and genocide in Canada. In response, National United Church official David Iverson circulated a 14-page character assassination of Kevin Annett to the world media, and threatened the New Internationalist with a boycott of their magazine unless it stopped all reporting of residential school crimes and Kevin Annett. New Internationalist editors buckled to this pressure and never again reported Kevin Annett's work. In March of 1999, the national magazine Canadian Dimension was similarly silenced after it ran an article by Kevin Annett on the Ahousaht land deal between the United Church and Macmillan Bloedel. United Church lawyers threatened Canadian Dimension with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit unless it publicly retracted the article, which it did. In September of 1997, the Vancouver Courier newspaper ran a front-page article on Kevin Annett that went into detail about Kevin's uncovering of land theft and other crimes by the church on Vancouver Island. United Church official Phil Spencer, who had helped arrange Kevin's dismissal from the church, tried to force a retraction by the newspaper and have the article's author, Clodagh O'Connell, fired. When this failed, Spencer went so far as to verbally harass Ms. O'Connell at her home.
I felt I had to call what I thought was the church back to its real soul, which had been lost.
And you felt you could?
Not by myself, but I felt I had to do that. I had to try.
Did it work?
Sure, it worked. Why do you think all the shit has happened? It's because it worked. After, losing my wife and kids, and trying to re-educate, trying to get a PhD, and then having that blocked, being unable to support myself, having to save my dimes and nickels every week to have enough money to go on the bus to see my kids for 2 hours, having to eat off plates in the university, other people's food, so I wouldn't have to buy dinner, so I'd have enough bus fare to see my kids. That made me feel like I was on the bottom, and that there was no one around to help me. Not even family. They just stood right back and said, well, this man should pull himself up by his own bootstraps. They didn't realize that there were all these forces in the world that were trying to keep me down that way, that the United Church did not want that PhD produced, that the RCMP did not want that tribunal done, and they tried to stop it.
But the more they tried, what did that do to you, the more they tried?
I got angry at them. I said, why? What the hell right do they have to do that to me? What the hell have I done wrong? Nothing. I said...
Did you lose your faith in
No, here's the wrong I did. The wrong I did was I expected the church to live by its principles. That was my wrong.
What were its principles?
It claimed to be following in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. To seek truth. They have this great statement in the United Church to walk humbly and seek justice, in the world. Well, I just expected them to do that. That's what it said on paper. I just asked them to live by their principles when it had to do with land they had stolen from the native people and children that they had hurt and murdered in the residential school. I simply said, do what's right. And I was told time and again that it was wrong for me to have done that.
You knew that it happened before. You were well read.
Yeah.
You realized that the last 200 years, 2,000 years that happened.
Yeah, but I was complicit in it. I was part of the culture that did it, and I was blind to it. Raised in that condition of affluence, I had an idea. I remember thinking when I was in my 20s, oh yeah, native people, yeah, they've been put down. I had kind of a vague idea that they were on the outs and they had been attacked and murdered en masse and all that, but it didn't enter my life at all. I mean, it didn't really... The only contact I'd ever had with native people was when I was 15. We went up to a village in northern BC on an exchange, and we lived for 10 days among Aboriginal kids up there, and then they came down into our community and hung out with us. But what I saw just blew my mind in that little community of Hazelton in northern BC. Just unbelievable. I didn't think people lived like that in Canada.
Lived worse than you did.
Well, I mean, yeah, even the poorest white person, they didn't come anywhere near the experience of what was going on in that village. Kids running around, I mean, not just literally without clothes and dying from malnutrition, but I mean, there'd be like, there was a little 6-year-old girl whose dad had gone after with an axe. She was carrying a mark around on her head because her dad had whacked at her while she was drunk. And that was just accepted. Like, I mean, oh yeah, well... It wasn't considered there was anything wrong with that. And I thought, well, these people, I think I was scared by that. And so when I got older, I thought, well, Native people are kind of an oddity. I don't really want to understand them too much. I mean, that was all going on in me. But then I realized I had to. The more I began to work with them, I had to understand.
And what did you come to understand?
Well, it didn't come right away. It came over time.
What came?
What genocide really looks like, up close. What it means to be at the receiving end of a campaign to exterminate you. What it means to be the survivors of mass murder. You go around with, you feel like you're going to die at any moment. You're going to be tortured at any moment again. So all you have to do is hide. You got to hide.
You could identify with that?
Oh, yeah. You look at Indigenous people and say, well, why would we despoil our river? Why would we grab more land than we need? Why would there be poor people in our midst and rich people? That doesn't make any sense. I mean, no society can survive living like that, and yet it's the virtue in our society to operate like that. So we're crazy. I mean, we have become completely insane. And it comes out of that, that terrible alliance that happened when you had this notion that a religion called Christendom was superior to all others and had to conquer the world, combined with the vested interest of a merchant class that wanted to conquer the world for its own profit, armed with this religion. Krishnamurti, who was a Hindu writer, he said a beautiful thing, and that's why I don't believe in religions. I believe the spirit is shared by people all over. But he said, God hides himself in the most broken ones among us, and God hides himself in the most broken parts of ourselves. Hidden in there, but present, like a little seed. And I'd say that our worst experiences are a way to reveal that and for us to find a new meaning and strength in our life. Because when you lose everything for the right reason, for a just cause, or for people who can't fight for themselves, when you stand with them and lose everything, you gain everything. You lose the false things in your life that we're so wedded to.
The only thing the church did to me, was say, I'm sorry, wrote a letter of apology. Thanks, writing on paper and saying verbally to me, saying I'm sorry, doesn't work. It makes me more angrier to think they can give me a few dollars and that'll make me forget.
No, we're not all one happy family. There's this whole world, like every society for 5,000 years, has rests on the suffering and misery and exploitation of some group of people. And you're not going to find God up in a church somewhere. You're going to find God down there in the garbage heap with those people. That, to me, is the message of Christ.
So why don't we get that, Kevin?
Because Christianity was hijacked by wealthy institutions and the rich, and it's been their servant for centuries, when it really belongs in the hands of the poor.
Now on, all generations will declare me blessed.
God has brought down the mighty from the throne and has lifted up the poor. God sent away the wealthy and has filled the hungry with good things. It's like what you get in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor and woe to the rich. He says that. And it's kind of like this big reversal. Suddenly all the things that the powerful, the government, the corporations, the churches, they all think everything's on our side. We've got the world wrapped up. We can go carpet bomb Iraq whenever we want. We can destroy anybody we want. Suddenly it's all reversed. And those things are their downfall. And the ones who they're bombing, suddenly you realize, like Martin Luther King learned and Gandhi learned, those are the ones with the power to change history, not those who think they're in charge. That's a revolutionary message, and that's what I tried to speak about from the pulpit in Port Alberni, and also to create. I tried to create it. I tried to put it into practice. And you saw what happened. I mean, it's not surprising what happened to me. And I'm taking strength from that now because I realize it's what happens when you try to live the message. You will get nailed, but that's their undoing. It's not my undoing. I'm not undone. They're undoing themselves. That's the victory.
From now on, all generations will declare me blessed, for the mighty one has done the most magnificent things to me. Sacred is this light that shines from within every one of us as we reveal. And it struck mightily with such great force, it uprooted and scattered the proud of their core, and then pulled down dictators from their thrones, and then stood up and walked with the lowest of the low, honoring them before all others.
I am now diabetic. I'm now on dialysis. I am losing my sight. My legs are giving out on me. And now I've got to realize too that I ain't got much time. I know that. But I want to give my love to my sons for what days I got left, because they gotta know that I do love them. Even though I couldn't tell them for years. But I do. I care about them lots. I didn't want to share my past with them, but I finally told them. They cried with me.
And fed the hungry with good things, put the wealthy on empty and sent them away. Hey, hey. Hey, hey. And then reawoke in human hearts compassion for all who've breathed this air before, and for all who suckle at this planet now, and for all to come forevermore. For all to come forevermore.